I'm Victor Curran, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord. Our group plans and presents events that educate and celebrate the men and women who made Concord the home of American independence and imagination. And we're honored today especially to partner with the Concord Festival of Authors to present this program. And it is a special pleasure to welcome Barry Andrews. Reverend Barry Andrews is a longtime friend of First Parish and of Concord, member of the Thoreau Society, and he has shared his insights with us here in past years. His study of the Transcendentalists and their writings examines not only their lives and their writings, but how their ideas resonate in the 21st century. In his new book, American Sage, he explores the public and private writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson and makes them accessible to today's spiritual seekers. This enlightening book considers the 19th century religious and intellectual cross-currents that shaped Emerson's worldview to reveal how his spiritual teachings remain timeless, modern, universal, and uniquely American. There will be a question and answer at the end of the presentation. If you're joining us on Zoom, use the chat button and type your question into the chat window. We'll have copies of American Sage for sale and signing at the end of our program. If you're watching us on Zoom, we will put a URL and discount code in the chat thread to order American Sage from the publisher, the University of Massachusetts Press. Barry is the author of several other excellent books. I think it's somewhere around 10 about Transcendentalism and the Transcendentalists that are available from the Thoreau Society shop in the Visitor Center at Walden Pond, and we'll post a link to their website in the chat thread too. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Barry Andrews back to Concord.
Well, thank you, Victor. Today the weather may be somewhat inclement, but I would have you ponder this. During one of Emerson's lecture tours to the Middle West, I can't remember the exact year, somewhere in the 1850s, he writes in his journal that he crossed the Mississippi River 3 times on foot during the winter. So I guess it shouldn't be so difficult for us to contend with what weather we have here. I do thank you all for the invitation to be with you today here in Concord. Because of the pandemic, I feel like I've been in exile from what has been for many years a place of personal pilgrimage. It also gives me an opportunity to share with you a bit of the fruits of my labors during this time of self-imposed isolation. I guess if there is a silver lining to this dark cloud, it's that I've had plenty of time to write. I've been reading Emerson for many years. I've learned a lot about him and from him. I've been inspired to write my latest book because of my experience with people like you, intelligent readers and spiritual seekers curious to know more about Emerson and his teachings. Conversation was one of Emerson's favorite spiritual practices. He wrote, "In groups where debate is earnest, and especially on high questions, the company become aware that the thought rises to an equal level in all bosoms, that all have become a spiritual property in what was said. They all become wiser than they were." It is in spirited conversation with groups like the Transcendentalist Circle here in Concord that I have deepened my own understanding of Emerson and found the inspiration to do what I can to bring the person and his spiritual message to a wider audience. I especially wish to thank Victor and Shelley for making this program possible. Today I'd like to talk about the spiritual legacy of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson's legacy is difficult to assess. His reputation has waxed and waned over the years. He has had effusive admirers as well as harsh critics. Yet his message has captured the imagination of generations of spiritual seekers. He noted proudly in his journal that after writing and speaking for many years, he had not now one disciple, as he put it. The reason was not because what he said was untrue or that he lacked an intelligent audience. Rather, his goal as a teacher was, he said, not to bring them to me, but to themselves. His teaching would be a failure if it did not create independence. Describing what he calls the shadow of Emerson's books, Walt Whitman wrote, "The best part of Emersonianism is it breeds the giant that destroys itself. Who wants to be any man's mere follower? Lurks behind every page. No teacher ever taught that has so provided for his pupils setting up independently. No truer evolutionist." Well, Emerson may not have wanted to be a mentor, but he was certainly a model. He was one of those representative men he wrote about, individuals who offer an example of persons who heeded their own genius and forged their own path, uncertain at times where it would lead them. "I am only an experimenter," he said, "an endless seeker with no past at my back." Yet he was well aware of his influence. In Nathaniel Hawthorne's delightful introduction to Mosses from an Old Manse, he wrote of Emerson, "His mind acted upon other minds of a certain constitution with wonderful magnetism, and drew many men and women, I would add, upon long pilgrimages to speak with him face to face." In uses of great men, Emerson cautioned against what he called the excess of influence of the great man. His attractions warp us from our place. He felt responsibility to push his acolytes away from him. Emerson never set out to be a sage. No sage ever does, nor did he ever consider himself one. The disagreeable word sage, often applied to him, would never have pleased him, his son Edward wrote. Seer is certainly better. He strove to report truly and temperately what he saw, and through all the beautiful and shifting forms, he traced the law with reverence and delight. From a young age, he simply adopted and persistently engaged in a variety of spiritual practices intended to cultivate the soul. In his lectures and essays, he offered advice to others on how to do the same. He did this with uncommon grace. "I am here to represent humanity," he wrote in his journal. "It is by no means necessary that I live, but it is by all means necessary that I should act rightly." His sagehood, whether he accepted the mantle or not, is the result of his integrity, the congruence between the person and the message. In the first chapter of my book, I cite the two ways that classical scholar Julia Annas said the virtuous or self-reliant person could be developed. "One is," she wrote, "the person living according to an ideal which transcends the everyday, rising above it and regarding ordinary life, its concerns and troubles, as petty and fleeting. The other is," as she put it, "a person whose ideal virtue is displayed not in rising above the everyday, but precisely in staying at that level and dealing with it." This is arguably the more challenging notion, since instead of contrasting the ideal and the practical, it tries to bring them into relation, showing how ideal virtue can be found in actual, practical, goal-directed activity. Emerson is the second type of sage. He viewed everyday life from a higher platform, as he would say, from an ideal perspective. When we think of ourselves as part of a larger whole, we loosen the grip of petty concerns. But instead of avoiding life, this type of sage takes an active part in it. As Anas says, these sages see the life detached from everyday practical concerns devoted to a transcendental ideal as selfish and self-indulgent. For sages like Emerson, virtue means living life well, mindfully, in accordance with that which promotes eudaimonia, or human flourishing. Emerson was engaged in the life of his family, his community, and society as a whole. He celebrated domestic life and civic duties. He felt obligated to involve himself in larger causes, such as the abolition of slavery and women's rights. We are not permitted to stand as spectators at the pageant which the times exhibit, he wrote. We are parties also and have a responsibility which is not to be declined. His gospel of self-reliance has sometimes been taken to mean a radical individualism at odds with the needs for community. But careful readers understand this was not the case. The heightened sense of the importance of the individual that emerged in the 19th century did not, as one might imagine, produce a diminished sense of community. Daniel Walker Howe writes in Making of the American Self. Instead, he said, a heightened sense of national community actually accompanied the rise of individualism. This was true for Emerson as well. He found meaning and joy in everyday life. I embrace the common, I explore and sit at the feet of the familiar, the low, he wrote. Give me insight into today, and you may have the antique and future worlds. He valued common people, too. He often found his lecture tours arduous, but he loved meeting people along the way. They energized him. I meet in the street, people full of life, he wrote in his journal. I see them pass with envy at this gift, which includes all gifts. The feeling was mutual. Elizabeth Peabody recalled asking a parishioner at the East Lexington Church, where Emerson was serving as an interim preacher, why the congregation had not hired a minister he had recommended. Oh, Miss Peabody, she said, we are very simple people here. We cannot understand anybody but Mr. Emerson. Although he mingled with Boston's intellectual elite, he was not an elitist himself. For Emerson, there was no social or religious hierarchy. He encouraged all to grow to their fullest potential. All that Adam had, all that Caesar could, you have and can do, Emerson wrote in Nature. Adam called his house heaven and earth. Caesar called his house Rome. You perhaps call yours a cobbler's trade, 100 acres of plowed land, or a scholar's garret. Yet line for line and point for point, your dominion is as great as theirs, though without fine names. Build, therefore, your own world. Philosopher John Dewey said Emerson called for a spiritual democracy. Against creed and system, convention and institution, Dewey wrote, Emerson stands for restoring to the common person that which in the name of religion, of philosophy, of art, and of morality has been embezzled from the common store and appropriated to sectarian and class use. For such reasons, the coming century may well make evident what is just now dawning, that Emerson is not only a philosopher, but that he is the philosopher of democracy. In addition to his spiritual egalitarianism, Emerson embraced an expansive, liberal, progressive view of America's destiny. In his address, Fortune of the Republic, given in December of 1863, following Emerson's Emancipation Proclamation and the Battle of Gettysburg. Emerson declared, "At every moment, some one country, more than any other, represents the sentiment and the future of mankind. At the present, none will doubt that America occupies this place in the opinion of nations. America," he said, "is passing out of old remainders of barbarism into pure Christianity and humanity, into freedom of thought, of religion, of speech, of the press, of trade, of suffrage, of political right." He was deeply saddened that it took the sacrifice of a whole generation to see a new era of equal rights dawn on the universe. He did not take America's fortune as a given, however. It had to be earned. The great end of all political struggle, he argued, is to establish morality as the basis of legislation. "'Tis not free institutions, 'tis not a republic, 'tis not a democracy that is the end, no, but only the means. We want a state of things in which crime will not pay, a state of things which allows every man the largest liberty compatible with the liberty of every other man." Despite his praise of America in that moment, Emerson was by no means a nationalist. He understood the tendency of his fellow citizens to put financial considerations above humane ideals. "I am a little cynical on some topics," he noted in his journal, "and when the whole nation is roaring patriotism at the top of its voice, I am fain to explore the cleanliness of its hands and the purity of its heart." He stood for the fusion of races and religions, the advancement of women's rights, the abolition of slavery, just rules for labor, abolition of capital punishment, and social services for the poor. He also called for a religious revolution in America. America is in fact the theologian of something we may almost term the American religion, writes Sidney Alstrom in his magisterial Religious History of the American People. Emerson's message wasn't, he said, a mere softening of traditional doctrines, but a dramatic and drastic demand for a complete recasting of religious life and thought. He set in motion a rapid transition from Christian dominance to religious cosmopolitanism in America. As Alstrom suggests, this was more in the nature of a revolution than an evolution. "Shooting the Gulf," one of Emerson's favorite phrases, meaning an exhilarating breakthrough, was most certainly what happened in the chapel at Harvard Divinity School on the evening of July 15th, 1838, when he gave his now famous address to the aspiring ministers. He did not pull down the walls of historical Christianity, but he did breach them, opening the door for a new way of being religious, grounded in nature and human consciousness. "The world," he said, "is not the product of manifold power, but of one will, of one mind, and that mind is everywhere active, in every ray of the star, in each wavelet of the pool. The religious sentiment is aroused by the elements of nature, the mountain air, and the scent of flowers. This teaching," he insisted, "dwelt always deepest in the minds of men in the devout and contemplative East, not alone in Palestine, where it reached its purest expression, but in Egypt, in Persia, in India, in China. It is available to all," he said, "guarded by one stern condition, this namely, it is an intuition. It cannot be received at second hand." Emerson was part of a group of young religious radicals preaching a new gospel. They were searching for ways of being religious, freed from orthodoxy and sectarianism. But he was a foremost proponent of decentered Christianity, creating what philosopher Charles Taylor has called a third form of secularity. Secularism commonly refers to religious unbelief and relegates religion to the periphery of civic life. Secularity, as Taylor uses the word, retains what Emerson calls the religious sentiment within the immanent frame. It is a this-worldly form of spirituality. Transcendentalism arose in a uniquely American context, observed Perry Miller, whose anthology of its writings reawakened interest in the movement in the 1960s. It is most accurately defined as a religious demonstration, he said. It broke away from a religion that was notoriously indigenous to eastern Massachusetts, Unitarianism, which itself had broken away from Calvinist orthodoxy. One might think, Miller said, that a heresy within so localized a sect may be thought of little interest or significance for the rest of an immense country. Yet, thanks largely to Emerson, the movement became a religious force in America, validating all those who sought spirituality beyond the bounds of Orthodox religion. Every essay and lecture Emerson wrote revolves around his spiritual vision. He addresses every issue: reform, power, wealth, success, society, politics, religion, social justice, from the perspective of a higher platform, gained through an awareness of the oneness of being of which we and all of nature are a part. He promotes the flourishing of individuals in society by means of the spiritual practices of self-culture. Heightened visions of an ideal world and social life could not be summoned at will. As poet William Blake wrote, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. In other words, we might become more receptive to visionary experiences when we cultivate our souls. As a minister, I've gained wisdom and guidance through Emerson's teachings and spiritual practice. As a teacher, I've seen how he enriches the spiritual lives of others when they grasp its meaning. In American Sage, I have taken Emerson's message to heart and explained as best I can the substance of his writings. Mine is not an academic or critical study, treating its subject at arm's length. Such books are important, but so are books, and there are really only a few, that make Emerson's writings intelligible to seekers curious to know what he was all about, written for the most part in everyday language. At the same time, I have sought to ground my efforts in solid scholarship, paying attention to accuracy and historical detail. Emerson is not for everyone, but if readers learn nothing else, it is that each of us must find our own spiritual path. That is all Emerson ever wanted for his audience. I'm reminded of a folk tale I heard many years ago, though I do not remember the source. One day a king summoned his 3 daughters to come before him. I'm going away to meditate, he said. You will rule in my place. He gave each of them a single grain of rice and said, keep this until I return. Well, the first daughter threw her grain of rice away. I'll just run down to the kitchen and get another one when he comes back. The second daughter carefully wrapped her grain of rice with a golden thread and placed it in a lovely box which she kept in a drawer. The third daughter thought about hers for a long time before she decided what to do. Years later, the king returned and summoned his daughters to come before him and bring their grain of rice. The first daughter ran to the kitchen, grabbed a grain of rice, gave it to her father, and he said, thank you. The second daughter carefully unwrapped her grain of rice and gave it to her father, and he thanked her. The third daughter said, come, father, I have something to show you. She led him outside of the castle, and with a wave of her hand, she showed him a vast field of rice waving in the wind. There, she said, is your single grain of rice. And her father said, you shall rule in my place. Emerson has inspired intellectuals, world leaders, and everyday people with his message. He has found his way, often incognito, into some of the best literature written and has influenced some of the best thinkers since his death. Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, John Muir, William James, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ralph Ellison, Friedrich Nietzsche, Leo Tolstoy, Rabindranath Tagore, D.T. Suzuki, Annie Dillard, Mary Oliver, Barack Obama, and countless others. He has transformed worship and theology in liberal churches, and he has done this without any school or association in his name, only through his enduring spiritual presence. As his friend Oliver Wendell Holmes said of him, here was an iconoclast without a hammer, who took down our idols from their pedestals so tenderly it seemed like an act of worship. The seeds he planted in the spiritual lives of his many readers have yielded a rich harvest in his own day and in all the days since. Thank you. I would be happy to answer, if I can, any questions or thoughts of your own. In what ways have you been provoked by your reading and knowledge of Emerson? Richard, did you?
Well, I had a question. Actually, in 1865, Emerson rejoined this church.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering if you think Emerson at any point had a sense of a personal relationship with God or the divine mind.
Well, it's hard to say. To a large degree, to a considerable degree, he was born and living in a Christian world. And the language and rhetoric available to him was largely Christian, and in his case, Unitarian. And so he often spoke, out of that tradition using those words. And yet, from about 1832, when he had a crisis of faith, he went to the White Mountains and he meditated over his situation. He just lost his wife, and he was losing his faith in the Unitarian Church. And he came to the conclusion, as he said, that religion is not credulity or ritual. It is, he said, life, or rather a new life of those faculties which you have. And I think from that time on, that's what religion meant to him, even if he continued to use some of the Christian language. Certainly by 1838, when he gave that divinity school address, he was speaking out of a post-Christian framework. Not that he went out of his way to disparage Christianity. I don't recall that he ever did, although he did find hypocrisy in the American churches and so on. And then, of course, as he matured and as he read further, he explored the spiritual writings of Hinduism and the Chinese philosophers, particularly the Neo-Confucians, and and also Sufi poets, and he found a real kinship with these, and he felt that if you got all of those people together, they could have a very productive and amiable conversation. It's just that all of the doctrines and rituals and teachings of the churches got in the way. So he had a very expansive view at that point. As far as his coming back to First Parish, I think those of you who have toured the Emerson house may have noticed the little drawer in Emerson's chair Thoreau put that in there. It was for Emerson's gloves, because when Lydian implored him to go to church with her, somehow he could never find his gloves. So Thoreau put that little drawer in there so he wouldn't have that excuse. So yeah, I trust he once said that the Sunday was wasted if the sermon was not a good one. So I think whenever he was able to hear a good sermon, he took advantage of that. And on his travels, even so far as San Francisco, if he was in a community over the weekend, he very often went to church on Sunday morning. So there you have it. I don't know if that entirely answers your question, Richard, but
If I could just ask that if anyone else has a question, I'd like to bring this mic over to you, because otherwise the people who are watching on Zoom can't hear the question. So, any more questions?
I think Jim has a question there.
So I would have answered Richard's question with the notion of the transparent eyeball, where he ends that quote with the "I'm part and parcel of God." It's a more Rubeneth Tagore type approach to what the divine is. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that? Or?
Well, yes. I mean, he did believe that there was one mind that was animated in everything, and that we could draw on that one mind, wisdom and energies from that one mind through practices of contemplation and other, and walks in nature and so on. Those brought him close to that. Yeah. Yes, Shelley, did you have a...
Reverend Anderson, I really enjoyed your book very much. What I was wondering about is I listened to Robin Wall Kimmerer's interesting speech last night, and she was talking about some of the problems in our world today of being estranged from the land, and also not seeing ourselves in a web of life. And she even used this word, this great green we. And so I was wondering, how would Emerson respond to that challenge?
Well, Emerson did contribute to that notion we have today of everything being a part of everything else. And he did challenge the typical Christian notion that we are somehow separate or estranged from nature, and that we're entitled to use it for our own purposes. Of course, he lived in a much more natural environment than we do today. So I don't know that he lamented, certainly to the extent that we do, the loss of animal life and the forests and so on. But his vision, which he spelled out in Nature and in other works, I think gave a lot of impetus to naturalists, scientists, and lovers of nature, in the decades and century later. I think Thoreau was much more explicit in seeing, the destruction of nature with the onset of technology than Emerson was, but certainly that would have been a concern. Certainly, if they knew then what we know today, I think they would be terribly disappointed, if not, righteously angry.
Thank you. It was fascinating. I look forward to reading your books. So you mentioned that in Emerson's world, you mentioned all the countries and then China, and you also mentioned his view of Hinduism and then Chinese Confucius philosophy. So in your research, how would you kind of summarize how he looks at the rest of the world, that is, the parts that he has not traveled, especially like East Asia, India? Thanks.
Okay. Emerson, Thoreau, and the Transcendentalists, I think, were the first writers, the first group of serious thinkers and intellectuals in this country to take the writings of India, China, and the Middle East seriously. Not just out of curiosity, although they did have curiosity, but also out of a desire to find inspiration and insight in these writings that they read. Now, their generation was really the first generation in America to be exposed to this literature. And it was coming out of largely the work of missionaries and colonial occupiers particularly of India and China. Nevertheless, and it came out kind of piecemeal, not all at once. So even though Emerson mentions the Buddha, I don't think he really understood the difference between Buddhism and Hinduism, Nevertheless, he did delve deeply as he could, into Hindu literature, particularly the Vedanta literature. And in Chinese studies, I'm not sure he appreciated the difference between, traditional Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism, which came along a couple of centuries after the life of Confucius, including the works of Mencius and others. Now, Neo-Confucianism emphasized the cultivation of the sage, and it was a very important part of the what became the Chinese educational system. So Emerson found kind of a kindred soul in this notion of self-development, moral self-development. That was true of his education at Harvard, his upbringing as a Unitarian, and his reading of the Stoics and other Greek and Roman philosophers. And also Vedanta. They all stressed the notion of moral self-development, and that's what drew him to them. Now, he also valued Sufi poets. I think not because the Sufi poets had a well-articulated notion of moral self-development, but because he was just exhilarated by their sense of a similar sense of exhilaration. As Emerson tried to find a language to express what he was thinking and feeling, he often went to some of these other religious traditions. And from Mencius, he got this notion of vast flowing vigor. That was how, it was translated in one of the works he read. Well, if they knew then, kind of what we know now, well, this vast flowing vigor is chi, which surges throughout all of life, and the encouragement and the abandonment to chi is the way to a flourishing life. But he sensed that was what that meant. One writer, philosopher, natural philosopher, writing today, describes his philosophy as ecstatic pantheism. Ecstatic pantheism. Well, I don't know how deep you want me to go into this, but the idea that Emerson explores is this notion that there is this vast flowing vigor throughout all of life, and that God is not separate from that. He may at one time have endorsed the idea of what panentheism, that God is in the world but also apart from it. I think he abandoned that, certainly with some of his later essays on nature and other things that he said. I think he came to believe that God was, however you want to, whatever term you want to use, was fully not only in nature, but the animating spirit within nature. Does that address some of your questions? Yeah.
If there are no more questions, then I would like to thank you all for being with us today, and thank you to everyone who's watching on Zoom. We do have copies of American Sage and other books that are available for sale and signing at the back of the room. And Barry is the author of several other excellent books about transcendentalism and the transcendentalists that are available at the Thora Society shop in the Visitor Center at Walden Pond. And I did post a link to both Barry's publisher and to the shop at Walden Pond in the chat. And I do hope you will join us for the Transcendentalism Council's next event on November 8th, when Sam Williams, the Executive Director of Concord Prison Outreach, will speak on social justice and prison reform. This program will be on Zoom, and I placed a registration link in the chat thread. So thank you all very much.
Mm-hmm.